It used to be 3 to 5 day cycles of 28 to 30 day rhythm, regular average flow. But 6 months after her Minaki, she started having 3 to 5 days withdrawal bleeding once in 2 months, which is highly irregular. But the flow used to be average. With time, by the time she got married, it was once in 3 months irregular cycles. She's been married for 8 years. And because she is an engineer, husband is an engineer, they did not really plan their pregnancy till 4 years after marriage. So when they started planning pregnancy, then because of her irregular periods, she would never ever know when her fertile time is and all that. So none of these calendars really worked out. And most of the common perception is that in the ovary there are cysts. That is what is called polycystic. By her history, you would have already understood that her ultrasound scan would have showed PCO. So when they decided to go ahead for a pregnancy, the perception is there are cysts which are abnormal, which are interfering with ovulation, and she underwent laparoscopy right when she started planning her pregnancy in 2015. Unfortunately, the details of what was done at the laparoscopy are not available. History and findings, I feel, are the most important thing that any doctor who's treating should be giving their people. So we did not really have any information on that. From the information that we had, in 2016, ultrasound showed no cysts. August 2016, she underwent ovulation induction. You can see that the ovulation was occurring on 16 to 19 days after the follicles were 18 to 19. Some of them regressed. The endometrium was 4.2 at HCG. After the use of sildenafil and estrogen, it had gone up to 8 mm. Later on, when we saw, when she had a report of a thickened endometrium. Later on, she had a report of bilateral ovaries small. There was no cyst, there was no corpus luteal cyst. So this shows us that there was a highly dysfunctional ovulation. She was not immune to rubella. The other investigations were within normal limits. In her hormonal evaluation, her FSH was 6. Her AMH was 3.93 and her TSH levels were around 4 in 2017. I saw her in 2019. This was what had happened previously. Because the laparoscopy findings were not available, she again had a HSG which showed a normal study. So what I usually like is to go back to the records and see what reports we have available and how did she respond to that, because that gives us a real guidance. So for this lady, she was given CC 100 milligrams for 5 days, followed by tamoxifen 20 milligram for 3 days. And then she was given HMG. And when you can see the follicles on the 9th day, there were small follicles, endometrium was 5. On the 11th day, when the follicles started growing, her endometrium was only 3. That means this endometrium is very sensitive to the anti-estrogenic effect of oral ovulogens, especially estrogen receptor modulators. And however we try to salvage this, she went on for HMG, she went on for sildenafil, she went on for that. The endometrium was only at the time of HCG 4.2 mm. So it is very unlikely that with that thin endometrium, she will conceive. And that tells us that we should not be using that drug anymore. She underwent 4 cycles of IUI between 16 and 17. And by the end of those cycles, at one of the scans, they had a strong suspicion of an endometrial polyp. And these were the other investigations which showed her other liver function tests and kidney function tests are within normal limits. So when she did not conceive, she underwent a hysteroscopy in Jan 2018, and I think that was the right decision, because when we have a strong suspicion of polyps, we don't know what else is there inside. And there were flimsy adhesions and adhesiolysis was done, curettage was done. And whenever we are doing a curettage, it is always advisable in India to check for mycobacterial tuberculosis. So then she underwent a cycle of IVF because she already had 4 cycles of IUI, and most probably they were all with gonadotropin, and you saw the type of endometrium she was having. So it was felt that an IVF will most probably be a better decision. And in an IVF protocol, because she's a known case of having thin endometrium, I think that was the reason Vitry freeze was done. And you can see that the baseline E2 and progesterone were within normal limits. There was an estrogen almost at the time of pickup, this must, because she had very few records with her, around 5,000, but the progesterone was on the higher side of normal. And so the embryo was frozen, and a frozen thawed embryo transfer was done. And the beta HCG was later on seen to be around 4,700. But at this point of time, when they did the ultrasound, there was no pregnancy sac seen intrauterine. And they had a suspicion that is it a ruptured and unruptured ectopic, partial hydrosalpinx, para-ovarian cyst. It was basically a pregnancy of unknown location with high beta HCG, and so she was given methotrexate for management, and she had a progressive fall in the beta HCG. Her blood tests were within normal limits. She underwent another cycle of frozen thawed embryo transfer later on. In this, of the embryos that were transferred, 2 were thawed, 2 survived, and the beta HCG later on was 30.8, which is suggestive of a biochemical pregnancy. And her previous prolactin was within normal limits. And because it was a biochemical pregnancy, they also had a karyotyping of the couple done. Her fasting blood sugar was a little on the higher side. She did not have any altered coagulability. Husband also had central obesity with a family history of hypertension, diabetes. Basically, they were having large and good fecundity, and the grandparents were alive till their 90s. So that's a great feature. And there was normal semen parameters. When we examined this girl, her BMI was 31. She had oily facial skin, hypertrichosis, and polydactyly. In this lady's family history also, there's a family history of hypertension, twins, and GI cancer. So on the first visit, when we did her ultrasound on 13th May, what I want you to note, if you can see the slide, is that it is very important in your ultrasound findings to document what is the scan we are doing, what is the frequency of the transducer, what is the day of the cycle, the uterus, do you think there is any pathology, the endometrium, do you think there is any pathology, in the ovary, what are you seeing, the total follicular count, whether there is any ovarian pathology, and if there are any other findings. So all these in a systematic manner, if we write, that means we've done a good scan and documented it. In hers, we thought she had a T-shaped uterine cavity, and on day 61, I could see a vascular CL. So we labeled her as a dysfunctional ovulation. And the antral follicle count, as you can see, are 18 and 10. We can't use this ovarian volume because this is not done post-menstrual and is having a vascular CL. The other ovary, in spite of having 10 antral follicles, is only 3.98. So at this point of time, we can't label her as PCOS according to this scan. And we called it, that's why basically it is a class 2, it's an ovulatory dysfunction, because a day 61 CL can never be normal. So this is a summary of all the previous investigations that she had. So it's my habit at the end of analysis of everything to put in what is the thing that is worrying me most, and what is the thing I feel good about her, and what is the plan of action. So unless we have that and counsel the couple regarding that, I think we're not doing a good job. So my concerns were that she is older, because Indian 30s is the Western 36s. She has hypothyroidism, she has central obesity, it's a class 2 ovulatory dysfunction. Previous conception occurred with IVF. First was pregnancy unknown location, second is a biochemical pregnancy. And she had one poor quality blast in freeze. There was inconsistent ovulation, luteinized unruptured follicles, thin endometrium with ovulation induction, intrauterine adhesions, and she was rubella non-immune. The good part was that she did have oocytes, there is fertilization, there is blastulation, tubes are patent, no tuberculosis, prolactin is within normal limits, coagulability is within normal limits, the couple, sorry for the spelling, karyotyping is okay, and the male factor looks okay. So with that, what was I planning to do with her? So basically, I was thinking, because I wasn't sure when I first talked to her whether we needed her endometrium. So I knew that. I was thinking, should we do an endometrial scratch? We should be continuing definitely a regular exercise, lifestyle modification, weight loss. Should we be using an insulin sensitizer? Should we be using metformin, acarbose, berberine, myo and D-chiroinositol, coenzyme Q10, lycopene, melatonin? Will any of these help? Should we be using 2 cycles of duphaston or a progesterone to restore the hypothalamo-pituitary gonadotrophin axis, which will also modulate the intra-ovarian milieu and get us better quality oocytes? And then, should I be doing an ERA? Should we go for an antagon ICSI cycle? There was no point in going back to an IUI cycle in spite of tubes being patent, because that's already been done. So with an increasing age, there's no point in trying out protocols that have already been done. So we did her lipid profile. And when we re-evaluated her hormones, we saw there was a minimum alteration in the FSH-LH ratio. Her AMH was 9. And we got her we checked her immune status again, and it was 91. So she became immune. Analysis was done. Male factor was looking okay. So then when we decided to go in for an antagon cycle, we continued her on thyroid hormones, vitamin D, inositol, some amount of berberine. So we tried, in general, coenzyme Q10, some amount of, because she was always having a thin endometrium, we thought maybe arginine will help, and steroid for an immunomodulator. Gave her recombinant FSH 200 units, HMG 2100, antagon. And because her AMH was very high and we did not want the risk of hyperstimulation, gave her a dual trigger. And we had 14 oocyte cumulus complexes, from which we got only 8 embryos. And at this point of time, her endometrium was not too thin. The progesterone level was not high. She did not have any hyperstimulation symptoms. And previously, both her frozen thawed embryo transfers did not result in a pregnancy. After discussion with the couple, they said, okay, let's try, since we have 8 embryos, 2 fresh embryo transfer and freeze the other embryos as 3 and 3. Unfortunately, her beta HCG was 2. She was still not mad. She was just disappointed with the result. But we were also pretty cool with the situation, because we had the backup of the frozen thawed embryo cycle. So later on, we did a frozen thawed embryo cycle. This was the 4th cycle of embryo transfer and second FET cycle. So we transferred the 3 embryos of grade 1, and grade 2. It was an extremely smooth transfer. There was a minimum amount of, because that manipulation of the internal loss, when we are giving a lot of estrogen, low dose aspirin, internal loss, it had a minimum spotting on the catheter. But 9 days after embryo transfer, she said she had spotting. So we did her beta HCG. It was 27, because it could be because some amount of HCG was also being used as luteal phase support. Excuse me. We got her repeat beta HCG and it was 172. But when we went on to do a scan, there is no intrauterine or extrauterine pregnancy sac. When we went on to repeat the beta HCG, we had a rise which was not sufficient and not compatible with a living, with a growing pregnancy. So because it was a failing pregnancy, all support systems were stopped. And then we had to sit down because now she was very upset. And now we had to go through the whole process of usually that in PCO, our primary thing in PCO is they don't ovulate. So she says, you could get me to ovulate, you could get so many follicles to grow, you could pick up so many oocytes, and you had so many embryos, and in spite of so many, why am I not having a baby? So we sat down, talked to the couple, their parents, and then we said, maybe there is something else we are missing rather than, because the embryos were so good and we were pretty confident that this or that cycle will lead to a pregnancy. That is what should happen. So we asked her to get a reproductive gene panel done. This is being offered by one of the labs. We have 20,000 genes, which are not expressed in all cells equally. And some of these genes are expressed only in utero. Some of these genes are expressed only in some organs of our body. So for embryo which is developing and the different organs that are forming at different parts of the body, different genes should be expressed. And for the endometrium also, to receive this, different genes should be expressed. So there is a set panel which tells us what are all the genes that is considered important for reproduction, in utero development, and is there something going wrong in them, which will give us more hints about how to go about it. And this lady's report came back that she is having 3 variations in her genes. One of them is a homozygous variant in the AMH gene. AMH, as you know, is a member of the transforming growth factor. And because of this polymorphism in this AMH, although she has good AMH, the expression of AMH is not so good in her. And that is one of the reasons why she has abnormal folliculogenesis and PCO. The second variant was a gene in the LH beta chain. So this one leads to abnormal ovulatory function. She had a third variation in the gene, which is in the NXA-A1, which is a protein in the NX family that is associated with coagulation and thromboplastin and the rest of the things. So this gene is associated with recurrent pregnancy losses. So now we had some information to tell her what could be the contributing factors. So the next question that immediately comes about is, what are we going to do about it? So there is not much we can do about, we can't change her genes. So the couple and the mother-in-law was counseled. And now what we are faced with, the options are, because she has 3 more embryos, go ahead for the frozen thawed embryo transference, pregnancy will happen, and maybe give her more of anticoagulants because she has an abnormal coagulation profile there. Other option is discard the embryos and plan an oocyte donation and ICSI and an embryo transfer after this crisis passed off. And right now the ball is in my client's court, and I should see what she will decide and come back and how things will go in future. So the purpose of sharing this is that the couple need a lot of emotional support and multiple sessions to be able to accept and understand their body and do this, and we need to give them a lot of time and hard decisions. Thank you, and I will stop sharing my screen. And if you have any questions, do put them up in the chat box. And I will now invite my next speaker for the day. Dr. Vishnupriya, are you ready?
Hello.
Vishnupriya, can you go on?
Thank you, Padmina. Your presentation was excellent. It is a very simple one. Your case is very nice case.
Yeah, please go ahead. Share your screen, please. You have the green button, share screen.
Yeah.
Can you click on that?
Yes, just 1 second.
Yeah. Trying to regard this PGTA-A. PGTA-A is for aneuploidies. That means if there is a couple who have a chromosomally abnormal baby, that means you've lost the pregnancy because of chromosomal abnormalities, aneuploidy screen and putting it, and that is works very well. Yeah, I think you can go back to your first slide, Vishnupriya.
Yeah.
First slide. So in those, if the pregnancy losses are with aneuploidies, screening for that and putting in an chromosomally normal embryo will help. We'll come back to this. Vishnupriya, the stage is yours. Please go ahead. Vishnupriya worked as assistant prof at Kurnool Medical College for 12 years. She started IVF Center in Kurnool, and she's been a very, very active member. And we meet, we are friends across conferences. So please go ahead, Vishnupriya.
Thank you for a nice introduction. My answer is in case of recurrent implantation failure, the patient aged about 32 years and married life is 6 years. Both wife and husband were doctors. She is a case of primary infertility and she came for IVF to our center 6 months back. So when we take the history, her menstrual regular periods with a normal flow, but with history of severe dysmenorrhea, and this is having since menarche. And she is having no other medical problems. But surgery, she underwent one laparoscopic right ovarian cystectomy in 2012, that is before her marriage. It was a serous cystadenoma. It's a large serous cystadenoma of size about 20 centimeters into 18 centimeters. But the CA125 was normal at that time. She just went to the doctor for she's feeling a tightness in the abdomen. So instantly they find that she's having cysts, and so immediately they planned for laparoscopic surgery and they did their right ovarian cystectomy. So after marriage again, 1 year after marriage, having regular periods and everything was normal. Suddenly one day she developed severe pain abdomen, and so she consulted a doctor. There again, when did the scan, to be left ovarian endometriotic cyst, about 4 into 5 centimeters size. So they planned for diagnostic laparoscopy was also planned as a matter. Already one ovary surgery was done, so they planned for laparoscopy and hysteroscopy. So in that laparoscopy, they find the left ovarian endometriotic cyst. They removed the cyst. Cystectomy was done, and both tubes were unhealthy as per the history. Were not available with the patient. As per the history, they told that both tubes were unhealthy, so they did the bilateral salpingectomy. And some small septum, they find in hysteroscopy, they find a small septum. So they did a septal resection and also metro. And they advised the patient to go for IVF. And they have given Lupron depot injection for 3 months also. After she planned for IVF, she consulted a local IVF center. And there they did self-stimulation because the left ovary oocytes, AFC were good. LMH was also good. They did self-stimulation, husband semen. They got good embryos, 5. And they did a fresh embryo transfer, day 3 embryo transfer of 3 embryos. But it was a failed conception. And again, they tried after 6 months. They tried again IVF with the remaining 2 embryos. According to her history, these reports were not with her. She told that endometrium was good, ovary was good, everything was fine. And so we did with the FET. But it was also a failed conception. And then they shifted to Delhi due to some job purpose. There they consulted the Nova Fertility Center in Delhi. There they tell her that the AFC count is very less. So they advised killing of the embryos, and they did OPU in 2 cycles, but they were able to collect only 2 embryos. But the embryos were of good quality. The ERA was done. At the Delhi, they planned ERA after giving this HRT under the suppression with overall and leupride depot, and then HRT was given, and ERA was done on September 18. But FET was done in February because the patient's personal problem, they could not do FET immediately after next cycle. They planned, it was done in February 2019. But again, it was also a conception. Again in June 2019, again she went to Dr. Nalini Mahajan in Delhi. She consulted Dr. Nalini Mahajan. Again, madam has given DHEA tablet for 3 months. Virus plus tablet was taken for 3 months because the AFC count is very less. After the 3 months of course, again they tried for self-stimulation. But they only one site was developed according to patient history. But at that time, again endometriotic cyst developed in the leftover. It is around 4 to 5 centimeters size.
Vishnu Priya, can you talk closer to the mic? Yes.
Okay,
please.
okay.
Now,
Yeah.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Only one oocyte was developed, but it was not up to the size. So on the day of OPU, they have tried to retrieve the oocytes, that single oocyte, but because of the cyst, were unable to pick up the oocyte. So they stopped the procedure and they suggested the patient to go for donor oocytes. So then patient approached us 6 months back. This was the ERA report. She approached us 6 months back. We did all the investigations again, including complete blood picture, complete urine analysis, and anti-thyroid antibodies, and thrombophilia profile like anti-cardiolipin antibodies, plasma, and beta-2 glycoprotein. Everything was done. All reports. And semen analysis was also done. It is also good. Every time semen analysis were done 4 or 5 times. They did in the Delhi also. Every time it was normal. And on doing ultrasound, the patient was having a posterior wall adenomyosis, small size, and left ovarian endometrioma is also there, around 4 to 5 centimeters size. It persisted from since 6 months, it seems. But right ovary is not seen, and that endometrium is normal. And AMH value is 0.5. So we suggested her to go for donor oocyte. Hysteroscopy, I did hysteroscopy also. Everything was normal in hysteroscopy. So then because of this adenomyosis and endometrioma, first on NMG once a day for 2 months, and leupride was also given for 2 months. Meanwhile, we have prepared donor for oocytes. Her own sister has donated her oocytes for her. She's having already children. She's aged around 30 years. Healthy children is it, and there is no problem with her also. So we got 5 good quality embryos from the donor, and these embryos were frozen. And we prepared this endometrium and we went for FET after 2 months of this leupride dose. So have given Novalan for 20 days and leupride 10 units BD for the luteal phase. And then after starting of the periods, we started Probinova TAD for 14 days and low dose aspirin, folic acid, RG Hope tablets, and also capsule Evion 400 mg also given. The 10 days we have done scan. The scan report like this. Endometrial thickness 9.7 mm, but it was somewhat echogenic. Triple layer only, but somewhat echogenic. And myometrial echogenicity was non-homogeneous. Mean artery PI was 2.9, but there is endometrial vascularity is very much less in this case. Myometrial vascularity is good. And when counseling the patient regarding this, endometrium is not perfect. Then she told that we will try one cycle. So we proceeded. The trial ET was done in the previous cycle. It was not easy. It was easy trial. ET was easy. So now we planned for ET with 2 blastoses. There were totally 5 embryos. Out of this, we thawed and transferred 2 blastoses. One in expanded stage, one in hatching stage. And ET was easily done with Cook's catheter. No blood staining of the catheter. Everything was fine. So after ET, we had given continued Proguanova TAD and Dufastan 10 mg and sustained 200 milligrams TD started, Visolone 10 milligrams, aspirin, Blastofix. 15 drugs was given, sustained injection once in 3 days, and HCG 2000 units once in 3 days, and we started Corparin injection, low dose, low molecular weight heparin also, 40 milligrams daily, subcutaneously started. And we have given intralipid also in this patient. Because of recurrent implantation failures, we have given intralipid, first dose on the day of HRT, second dose on the day of embryo transfer, and third dose was given on the day of beta HCG. Beta HCG value done on 14th day of ET was 2740 milliunits. So we have given the third dose of intralipid on that day. But after the patient has developed a sudden severe pain abdomen and spine PV, and she has come to the clinic. When I did the scan, there were small intrauterine gestational sac, 2 small intrauterine gestational sacs. We counseled her and boosted her. Oral boosting was done and continued the same treatment. And but after 2 days, after 5 days, again she came with heavy bleeding and she aborted. So that was the case. Now, after doing all this, now we are planning. We suggested her to go for sperm DFI and also PGS. So, while coming to the discussion, these are all the factors responsible for recurrent implantation failure. This patient is having multiple problems like endometriosis, adenomyosis, and also some endometrium problem is also there. So we have and maybe embryo also there. So we suggested her to go for PGS next time. So 3 embryos are so before going for next FET, we suggested her to go for PGS and also this sperm factor. And so if it is normal, it is okay. Otherwise, we advise her to go for a higher center where the microfluidic max is available. So this is the case.
So we'll come back to you, Vishnupriya, for the discussion and the questions.
Yeah.
So can you stop sharing your screen?
Yeah. Right.
So basically, life is always a mystery. So there is no way in which we can tell that this embryo will definitely implant in this endometrium at this point of time. We'll come back to the questions. We are getting good questions, but I thought we will finish off with the discussions because none of us knows what the other person is presenting. So it's as much I'm curious about all the cases as everyone else is. I think next person, Swapna, are you ready? Is Swapna there? Can you see her, Dr. Kiran?
Ma'am, she's there. She's there.
Yes. So, Swapna, can you share your screen, please? Yes. Meanwhile, what is blastophyx? Vishnu, Swapna, you're here. Fine, great. Can you share your screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Slideshow. Yes. Swapna has done her fellowship in reproductive medicine, and she works at Ramesh Hospitals and has her own fertility center, Pomely Fertility Center. And it's nice that at any time any work needs to be when I ask for volunteers, I get her showing her hand and coming up, and I really like that enthusiasm. Swapna, please, the stage is yours.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for your introduction. Am I audible, ma'am? Clear?
Yes.
Yeah. So today I'm going to share one of the case what we have managed at our center. So she's a 30-year-old lady who was married for 5 years, and she presented to us with a history of primary infertility since 4 years. So her menstrual history, very regular cycles, no significant menstrual irregularities other than just mild dysmenorrhea, no significant coital history, and no other past medical or surgical history. She has been used barrier methods for in the initial 1 year. So she has been trying for pregnancy since 4 years. So previously, like 2 years back, she has tried ovulation induction for 4 cycles. After that, she has discontinued the treatment in between. And this is the first visit she made to us at our center. So on examination, her BMI was 20.9, no obvious neck swelling, bilateral breasts were normal, systemic examination was normal, per abdomen soft, and speculum examination, a mild erosion was seen and pap smear was taken. On PV examination, right fornicial tenderness was present, uterus of normal size, and left fornix was free. So then we proceeded for further evaluation. Her initial investigations like CBP and all, complete blood picture was normal with raised ESR. Her AMH was 2.2. And other basic blood tests like thyroid, viral markers, where everything was normal. On ultrasound, right hydrosalpinx was detected. Uterus was of normal size and endometrial thickness was 4.2. Both ovaries were normal with the antral follicle count of 10 and 9. Male factor was evaluated, and male factor was normal, normospermia. So because on seeing the ultrasound, right hydrosalpinx and her BMI being 20.9, so we just inquired because she didn't give a significant family history when we inquired in the initial visit. Then when we inquired, then she said she had a sister who had a pulmonary cox and has been treated 10 years back. So with the suspicion in mind of, because she had a prior history of contact to a pulmonary cox, so we have done a Montus test and it turned out to be positive, and chest X-ray was normal. So because the ultrasound was showing the right hydrosalpinx, she has counseled for hysterolaparoscopy. So on hysteroscopy, there were flimsy adhesions just near the font.
Oh, Swapna, your system has hung.
Hello, madam.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, on hysteroscopy, flimsy adhesions were seen at the fundus. Other than that, no other significant findings. Left ostia appeared stenosed. So endometrial biopsy was done, and biopsy was sent in 2 samples, one in formalin for histopathology, the other in normal saline for gene expert. We have the gene expert facility. Then proceeded with laparoscopy. On laparoscopy, initial my port, just below the port, we can see the omental adhesions, what we have noticed. Then there were peri-ovarian and peritubal adhesions, mostly on the right side. The left side was clear. So right hydrosalpinx was seen and the left tube was congested and edematous. Adhesions mostly seen involving the right ovary and the right fallopian tube. There were no tubercles nor caseous spots or endometriotic spots. So we just proceeded with adhesolysis. And because the right tube was totally congested and edematous, we proceeded to right salpingectomy. Then we have done the chromotubation. On chromotubation, the left tube, there was no spill. So next, the histopathology findings. Surprisingly, the HPE of the endometrial biopsy, they just gave the secretory phase endometrium. Other than that, few plasma cells are seen. No epithelioid granuloma seen, because the presence of epithelioid granulomas indicate the diagnosis of genital TB. But there was no epithelioid granulomas. Bits of endocervix were there, which showed acute and chronic endocervicitis. And gene expert also turned out to be negative. But the cut section of the fallopian tube, the right salpingectomy, the fallopian tube, they have given, the pathologist has given non-caseating granuloma seen suggestive of tuberculous salpingitis. So this finding gave us guiding to go ahead with the ATT, because the HPE was positive and the positive lab findings, and with a prior history of family exposure to a case of pulmonary cox, we started her on ATT. So 6 months, so 2 months of 4 drugs and 3 months, 2 months plus 4 months, we have given 2 drugs, isoniazid and rifampicin. After 6 months, she comes back to us because the left tube was blocked. She has been counseled for IVF prior itself. So she has been started with IVF programming. So with a conventional antagonist protocol, we have programmed her for IVF. And then we got 10 oocytes, out of which 9 were mature oocytes. ICSI was done and all 9 were fertilized. So we have frozen day 3 embryos, 9 embryos we have frozen. Then next plan for frozen embryo transfer cycle. So in the first embryo transfer, as usual, we start with a low dose of Progainova, which is a common drug what we use. It's a 4 milligram dosage. And later it was titrated with up to 8 milligram. Along with that, other additives like sildenafil and vasodilators we have added. But on ultrasound evaluation, the endometrium was only 4 mm till day 21. So counsel the patient that in view of this thin endometrium, we have to cancel the cycle. Next cycle, we have counseled her to use the transdermal estradiol, just asking her, let's see, because the change of preparation might improve your endometrial thickness. But patient belongs to a very periphery place, which she is not comfortable to use a transdermal preparation. So I have changed her next cycle to estradiol hemihydrate, which is another preparation of estradiol. And I have started with 6 milligram of estradiol hemihydrate, and which was titrated up to the maximum dose of 16 milligram, which we never give usually up to 16. But still ultrasound monitoring was done. And on day 25, still it was only 5 mm. So again, the patient was counseled that we have to cancel this cycle. At least minimum 7 mm we need to go for frozen embryo transfer. So she was counseled for injections and a higher dose for the next cycle. So next cycle, I have started her with tamoxifen. So tamoxifen 20 milligram once a day was started from day 2 of her cycle for 5 days, along with estradiol hemihydrate 8 milligram from second day of her cycle, along with other adjuvants. So review scan after 1 week showed the endometrial thickness of 5.8. Then I counsel her for the low dose injection HCG. Usually Pubergen Nano is the injection what I use in my practice. So 150 units subcutaneously was started after 7 days of estradiol. So 150 units for 1 week we have given. On day 17, her endometrial thickness improved to 7.1 with Applebaum classification of blood flow to zone 3. So again, so we started with the luteal phase support with vaginal progesterone and planned for day 5 embryo transfer. So we have thawed the day 3 embryos and then cultured till blastocyst. So 2 blastocysts we got. So these are the blastocysts what we got, 4AA and 3AB. So these 2 blastocysts were transferred and she had a successful twin pregnancy. On her day 14, the beta HCG is 1348. So this is a recent ultrasound her gynecologist has shared with me 2 days back, because after 13 weeks, she was gone back to her regular gynecologist. This is a recent scan report which she shared with me, which shows 28 weeks pregnancy with fetal weight of 1.2 and 1 kg baby. So this case, so when we suspect a case of genital TB, so we all know that luteal phase, I mean the secretory phase endometrial biopsy is the diagnostic. So culture is the gold standard for diagnosing the female genital TB. So to summarize how to diagnose, because this is a very biggest dilemma, how to diagnose the genital TB. So in short, I thought I will discuss what are the recent diagnostic tests which are available to diagnose the genital TB. So premenstrual endometrial biopsy, send it for AFB smear, either culture, gene expert, PCR and HPE. If any of the test is above positive except the PCR, it is a confirmatory for genital TB. So we can start ATT. So any of the tests like culture or gene expert or HPE showing granulomas, it is a confirmatory test, except only PCR. So if only PCR is positive, then next what to do? So if the PCR is positive, correlate with the clinical findings. If the hysteroscopy and laparoscopy findings are normal, then just it is a TB is ruled out. So no need of ATT. If lap and histo findings suggestive of any presence of tubercles or caseation or adhesions, or hydrosalpinx or a TIVO mass, start ATT. These lap and histo findings along with a positive PCR give us a clue for genital TB and we can start the ATT. So to summarize this genital TB, 16% of the cases of infertility in developing countries is due to genital TB. In our case, the patient was asymptomatic. Even her menstrual cycles also were regular. There was no menstrual dysfunction. So majority of the people will be asymptomatic in the early stages. So good history taking, like family history and thorough history taking, thorough clinical examination and judicious use of investigations will help in the diagnosis of genital TB. So lab and histro, especially, they will be helpful in the early diagnosis to know the severity of the disease as well. So medical treatment using DOTS is the treatment for TB. And if the patient has bilateral tubal block, patient can be counseled for IVF and ET. A few words about thin endometrium, what we have faced in this patient. So already hysteroscopy was done. So any patient with thin endometrium, hysteroscopy is the first line of investigation, and biopsy, endometrial biopsy, so that if there is any evidence of plasma cells which suggest you of endometritis, so treatment of infections is the next step. Next is hormonal manipulation, that is estrogen, what we have given. There are two different forms of estrogen, estradiol valerate, estradiol hemihydrate. Estradiol hemihydrate is a better form compared to valerate because first pass metabolism is less, and hemihydrate binding to the receptors, estrogen receptors, is also very good. And HCG injection nowadays, it is very good usage even in thin endometrium. Low dose HCG, that is up to 150 units, because HCG will help in improving the endometrial receptivity. It also improves the cytokines and growth factors. So HCG is the other thing. Then mid-luteal GnRH agonist. In our center, we give mid-luteal phase day 6 post-embryo transfer 0.1 milligram of triptorelin. That is because agonist will rise the LH, which can help in supporting the corpus luteum, which will secrete the progesterone. That is one concept. The other concept of agonist usage in luteal phase is it will increase, it has a positive effect on the endometrium as well as the embryo. So it is known to improve the implantation rates. The other thing is tamoxifen, which I forgot to mention here, because when I was doing my post-graduation, we have done a study at our own center in AAA Madras Medical Machine, where we have used tamoxifen from 20 milligram to up to 80 milligram also in patients with thin endometrium. We had a very good response with tamoxifen. Still, the patient does not respond to tamoxifen. Then we go for advanced treatments like PRP. PRP, that is platelet-rich plasma. In our unit, we use PRP, we can prepare in our own unit. Like basically, we follow like 1200 RPM for 12 minutes, followed by 3300 RPM for 7 minutes is our protocol. And we infuse it on day 10 and again review the patient after 48 hours. And if still the endometrium is less than 7 mm, we re-inject the second dose of PRP. And this vitamin E, sildenafil, low-dose aspirin, and L-arginine are the routine adjuvants what we use in improving the endometrial perfusion. And I think, thank you so much.
Thank you, Komali, for this nice case. And I think we have 2 more interesting cases coming up. Harsha, are you there?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, Harsha, can you share your screen?
Yeah.
Hi, good evening. Can you share your screen? Yes. Screen? Share. The green button down. Share screen.
Yes.
Yes.
Visible, madam?
Yeah, it's going to come out. Okay. Harsha has also done her fellowship in reproductive medicine, and she's the clinical director of Birthright Health Fertility Center, Guntur. And you can see that she has presented at papers at various state, national, international conferences, and has got the best paper award at AP-COG and gold medals in various. So we have a dynamic, bright young girl. So Harsha, you can go ahead with your presentation. Just move up and start clicking. It should go through. Yes.
My case is more or less in lines of Dr. Swapna, who was presented earlier. This is a lady, 29-year-old with primary infertility, and she's married for 4 years. And her cycles are significant menstrual history apart from this. And she has visited us in the month of May, and just 1.5 months prior to her viscoscopy in the place where she lives in Hyderabad, she carries a discharge summary with her, which is actually giving the diagnosis as on laparoscopy, they found left hydrosalpinx and left ovary cyst, for which cystectomy was done, and this tube was blocked. And the right tube also, there was mild hydrosalpinx and it was patent, and they have done right ovarial drilling for the reasons which they've not actually mentioned prior to the evaluation. And having mentioned that because of the hydrosalpinx on both sides, they have done the tubal delinking of the both on both sides. And they have also evaluated her with the hysteroscopy, and where they have mentioned that the endometrium and cavity were normal, and they have taken the endometrial biopsy sample and sent it for histopathology. So this is a case of primary infertility with already having already had a histro lab done outside. And when I have evaluated her, I found that her uterus, I've done an ultrasound and found that her uterus was adenomyotic, and on both sides, the ovaries are with very less number of follicles, 2 to 3 on each sides, and her in the right adnexa, we could see an adnexal collection which is tubal, and it was a hydrosalpinx which is around 2 centimeters into 2 centimeters. So there was minimal fluid in the pelvis, and we have tried to correlate with the AMH, which is also very less, 0.4. And having evaluated her, was found to be near normal with mild teratospermia. So having explained to the patient about the low ovarian reserve and also the pregnancy rates with this kind of reserve, when they tried for self-oocytes, the couple has opted for the donor oocyte program. Afterwards, we have discussed very well about the tubal factor and implantation issues, and I tried to monitor her endometrium as well as the cavity. Since she has already underwent hysterolaparoscopic elsewhere just 2 months prior to her visit in our hospital, I have tried to do a saline histogram where the cavity was found to be normal. The endometrial lining was absolutely regular, and the distension was also quite good. And the hydrosalpinx, which was seen in the ultrasound, was again seen without any increase in the kind of, which means probably because of the delinking which I've done, or probably with the tubal block, that hydrosalpinx to the cavity. So we tried to proceed with the embryo transfer, but having seen her findings in the laparoscopy of hydrosalpinx as well as in ultrasound, we always had the suspicion, and we always tried to rule out the tuberculosis in this patient. And also because of the low ovarian reserve, which could be probably due to some kind of immunological pathology or the infectious pathology like tuberculosis, which may also lead to poor ovarian reserve. All these things had actually made us to think in terms of tuberculosis, and we have evaluated her with the endometrial biopsy, where we have sent for TB culture, TB PCR, AFB staining. None of the tests were suggesting infection of the tuberculosis. So we have proceeded with the embryo transfer after doing ICSI with the husband's sperms and the donor oocytes, and she got good blastocysts and 8 blastocysts, and we have transferred 2 grade 2 day 5 blasts, and then she had conceived, and it was a dichorionic diamniotic gestation. And later on, after confirming the pregnancy, she again went back to her place, and there she had regular antenatal visits. So she had been on and off contacting us over phone regarding her health status, and she occasionally complained of cough which she says that this usually gets aggravated when she is exposed to some pungent smells or a strong smell. So, and she said this is not so disturbing to her, and so she carried and she managed with that complaint, except that the rest of the pregnancy was uneventful. And then suddenly she, at 16 weeks of period of gestation, she had pain and bleeding, and she immediately consulted the doctor, which she has been actually visiting during her antenatal period. And then then the labor proceeded with the spontaneous abortion on the same day, and none of her antenatal scans were suggestive of any cervical shortening, because all the time her cervical length during her antenatal scans was absolutely fine. It is more than 3 centimeters. So after the miscarriage, after 20 days, again she came back all the way from Hyderabad to Guntur, telling that she had severe abdominal discomfort and little bit of shortness of breath. And while we have examined her, she has got anemia, severe anemia, and she's also giving the history of dry cough, which has become more severe for the last 3 weeks. And during her antenatal period, since she conceived, she has lost a significant weight of almost about 15 kgs. On examination, her vitals are very stable, and except for slight tachycardia, which is seen, pulse rate is only 90. And on ultrasound, I found that her endometrium was little bit thick and heteroechoic, 9 millimeters, with slight vascularity. Probably they could be retained products and with a minimal, with a significant fluid in the pelvis. So with such amount of significant fluid in pelvis and history of discomfort, am I audible?
Yes, yes, you are. Go ahead.
So such significant discomfort.
Harsha, your voice is, we are losing you.
Am I audible now?
Yes, you're audible now. So we are also curious what is there inside. Your slides are gone?
Yeah. Ma'am, are the slides seen, madam?
Yeah, slide is seen. Yeah, you can go ahead.
So beta HCG was only 15, so I did not bother much about the beta HCG. And and her counts were normal. Chest X-ray was also absolutely normal. So having probed her again and again of the past history, she was giving the history that she had similar complaint of cough with a fever somewhere way back 8 to 10 months prior to her visit to our place, and where when she has been hospitalized, and then the physician had done few tests, and then he has given some antibiotics, and the cough and the fever, they have actually regressed, and she went back home. The physician has advised her that you need the evaluation for tuberculosis. If at all you have one more episode of the similar picture. This history was she did not give during her evaluation for infertility. So we have advised her to stay back for ascitic fluid analysis, since on CT also this fluid was given as significant ascites with omental thickening. So we thought of evaluating the ascitic fluid. But since she had an urgency to go to her place because of her job, so she left back to the Hyderabad and consulted the same physician whom she has consulted 8 months back. So he has done the ascitic fluid tap, and then he has sent all this fluid for analysis. The adenosine deaminase level was known in duration, and the total counts of in the ascitic fluid were elevated, and also the lymphocyte count is also significantly elevated, and ESR also is suggestive of the tuberculosis infection, and the cytopathology is giving the information that it is rich with lymphocytes as well as histiocytes. As expected, the glucose levels have reduced and the protein content was being elevated in the ascitic fluid. All these, they give the picture of probable tuberculosis as a diagnosis. That is the tuberculous peritonitis. The gold standard diagnostic test, as it has been discussed earlier, like AFB culture, microscopy, and all these things, she did not carry these reports, and she could not give the history whether it has been done or not. This information has been informed us by the phone, that the reports have been given over the phone. So in this case, when we are trying to evaluate her, we are always thinking in terms of tuberculosis, and she's also having associated infertility, poor ovarian reserve. All these have made and having history, but still we try to rule out the causes, and we try to rule out the tuberculosis by the way we have imaged her, and by the way we have tried to extrapolate the laparoscopic findings to the present scenario. So the laparoscopic findings were actually like, they are subtle. They are not like clear-cut evidence of diagnosing this as tuberculosis specifically. There, of course, there is a hydrosalpinx, but it could be because of any cause which is causing the PID. So having the history of this, having the findings of this laparoscopy, we could not think in terms of proceeding with the antitubercular treatment, because her culture, her AFB smear, her PCR, everything was negative. That means probably the endometrium would have not been affected, or probably it would, because of the paucibacillary nature, these tests could not pick up the bacteria when we have tested. And yeah, this could be a probable cause for having missed infection for this patient. So probably this could be because of the clinical features or the laparoscopic features of the hydrosalpinx, and also the poor ovarian reserve, and also the current scenario of having been diagnosed with tuberculosis peritonitis or the abdominal tuberculosis. We can retrospectively think in terms of the tuberculosis which has actually affected the women. This tuberculosis probably would have been healed, or this is a kind of latent or healed tuberculosis which did not which is not diagnosed in the current bacteriological confirmatory test, and so we have not proceeded. So what is latent TB actually per se? Means latent TB is a manifestation, is an infection where the bacilli are actually present in the human body, but still they do not cause any symptoms, or they do not get manifested. So this kind of latent tuberculosis picture is seen in most of the women who are present with the infertility. The thing is that the early tuberculosis and the latent tuberculosis, we often tend to miss them during our diagnosis part. I've already discussed, probably would have been a healed or latent tuberculosis which got reactivated due to the immune suppressed state of the pregnancy, and hence it would have probably caused this pregnancy loss, because the cause of miscarriage could not be actually a painful labor, is not pointing towards the cervical cause. And also post transfer, I have actually put her on heparin as well, because always I've been thinking in terms of tuberculosis or some immunological pathology which has given the women with this kind of picture. So I was thinking of any vascular thrombi formation or autoimmune pathologies, which would actually lead to some implantation problems. So with that dilemma, I have actually started her with heparin. So now we cannot attribute the pregnancy loss probably even with it is not because of the immunological causes, also because I have already supported a little bit with that. So when I try to look,
shall we go on? We'll come back to this when you're thing, because we are running a little short of time, and we've saved Dr. Sujata Velanki for the last because she's one of the best. Huh? Shall we come back to you?
yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Sujata, are you there? Harsha, you need to stop sharing. Yes, that's great. Sujata, can you share your screen, please? Dr. Sujata is clinical director, Oasis Fertility Unit at Vijayawada, and she is right now our very dynamic WOGS secretary. So we get to have her greeting every day early in the morning with what are the webinars that are around. Okay, Sujata, we are waiting to hear you. Can you go ahead with your presentation?
Yeah, a very good evening to all of you. Thank you, Dr. Padmaja, for giving me this opportunity to present this case in the first ever case series of AP chapter of ICTA. And thank you, Dr. Kiran from SHIELD, for giving us the opportunity. Since I'm a bit into kind of teaching, probably I would have made this presentation in a real sort of a case presentation, but I will try to rush the slides and not bore you with the details much. So going straight away, generally whenever we do a case presentation or whenever we take a case or a history, we'll have to always think about and look at what are the possible causes. And the most important thing is we need to give the assurance to the couple in terms of what are the good things that they have and what are the things which are not going well with them and that which we need to address them. So this lady is very young, 30 years, though married for 8 years, is a homemaker, and she's been trying to conceive for last 6 years, and she came with history of secondary infertility. Unfortunately, she had 2 deaths, 2 babies dying, and 1 miscarriage with a recurrent pregnancy loss. So there was no history of any contraceptive usage in the last 8 years. She is having a history of 3rd degree consanguineous marriage. Coital history was nothing much significant except for an infrequent intercourse, and this is one thing is that the husband does not stay with her and he stays abroad and only comes and visits her once in a week, 2 months in a year, and but still they're aware of the fertile period. Menstrual cycles are pretty much regular, and I just put the history in terms of like generally how we do the history for the fellows or for the postgraduates who do the presentation. So I just didn't want to miss the things, but I will just tell you that it is a regular normal menstrual history with regular cycles. Going a bit into more in detail to the pregnancy history or the obstetric history, she had her first pregnancy which she conceived spontaneously, and then at the 5th month during the scan they said that she has an ovarian cyst, and then later on they did tell her that the baby was having a clubfoot, and so after the baby was delivered they found the clubfoot was there and it was corrected, and at the 7th month the baby was unable to lift the head and there were delayed milestones in the baby, and they henceforth ordered a karyotyping for the baby, and the karyotyping was found to be abnormal with a deletion in the chromosome number 5 at the level of exon 7 and 8, and unfortunately this baby died of spinal muscular dystrophy at the age of 1 year with pneumonia and breathing complications. The second pregnancy she conceived immediately after the first pregnancy, and the baby had an ymphaloceal and a diaphragmatic hernia which was diagnosed in the late scans, and this boy had an early neonatal death. The third pregnancy, between the second and the third pregnancy, she was operated for the ovarian cyst, which was mentioned in the first scan, and then she conceived after that, and unfortunately that was an early miscarriage at 8 weeks of gestation. So with this history, the couple came to us with a very heavy heart, with recurrent pregnancy losses, and for further evaluation. Her past history was nothing significant except for she had been on thyroid medications from the last 2 years. And when I looked into the evaluation for recurrent pregnancy loss, except for the genetic component that the couple are having, she did not have any significant autoimmune diseases, no history of hereditary thrombophilias, no history of any infections, endometritis, white discharge per vagina, no menstrual irregularities, or no history suggesting decreased menstruation, because I'm looking at presence of any synechiae or any adhesions following previous miscarriage, and there was no history suggestive of any uterine pathology in terms of fibroid or polyps, so there was no menstrual abnormalities in the history. There was no history of any uterine surgeries except for that this I was asking to look out for causes of any endometrial damage. Both the deliveries were normal vaginal deliveries, and she did undergo laparoscopic ovarian drilling after the second pregnancy. And just before she came to me, she did have a laparoscopic cholecystectomy as well. In the family history, father was a hypertensive. There was no history of any diabetes. The father's brother, she gives history that he had died of some respiratory problems at the age of 30. And she has a brother who died at the age of 25 years, and she was very young at that time, and she doesn't know what exactly has happened to that brother who died. And the rest of the history in the family was nothing significant. Coming to the male partner, he's a private employee. He stays in Singapore, and he just often visits her when he has his leaves. And there were no history of smoking, alcohol, or medical disorders. A semen analysis at our hospital showed about 2 ml and 16 million per ml was the count, and good amount of adequate motility and 2% normal forms. We do the classification of semen analysis as per the WHO criteria, and on examination, the BMI was normal, 25 normal, guilt, breast and thyroid were normal, vitals were stable, local inspection was normal, cervix and vagina was healthy, uterus was normal inside. We just make a habit of doing the examination and the vitals in the first visit itself, because in case of any vaginal discharges, they can be addressed and treated in the same setting. So provisional diagnosis of a secondary infertility, para 2, deaths 2 with 1 miscarriage, recurrent pregnancy loss. Only thing we can look at is a genetic cause of a chromosomal deletion with hypothyroidism and not having frequent intercourses, but then she did conceive immediately during all her pregnancies, so that was not a major problem. So the good things about her was that she was a young female, normal BMI, having regular cycles and normal semen parameters. So whenever we look at the history, we need to look at the positive points first and then go over the negative history of what we are trying to address. So at our center in the visit at where I had done her scan, which was showing an adequate amount of antral follicular count, uterus was normal, and we had planned in terms of having a genetic consultation, which was done at NIMS Hyderabad, to look at the possibility of that chromosomal analysis, and along with initiating the basic workup for IVF treatment for her, we have simultaneously ordered for a karyotyping for the couple. And in the karyotyping and in the genetic analysis, both the parents were diagnosed to have heterozygous carriers of an autosomal recessive disease, which was spinal muscular dystrophy. So the one important option, what happened is normally we have this deletion for spinal muscular dystrophy at chromosome number 5, but these couple had this SMN gene deletion on chromosome 1, and each one of them had a deletion of these gene at a different set of exon, that is exon 7 and exon 8. And the peculiarity, I hope I'm not confusing you much, but this is something very new about, or which is very rare, I should say, is that generally what we have read in an autosomal recessive condition is that the wife has a recessive, the carrier of one gene, the husband is a carrier of the other gene, And when they do when the embryo is formed and the baby is formed, we have a homogeneous outcome, and which ends in the pregnancy, which is going to be abnormal. But however, here they were having a heterozygosity of the same SMN1 gene at different exons, and the first baby happened to carry both the genes, and he was homozygous deletion of the problem, and he had this condition. So there was a thorough evaluation of why this was happening and how and what was the possibility of this condition. And then we had a karyotyping and probe evaluation of all the family members, because if you can look into the collecting the history, when I have told initially they were in a consanguineous marriage. So, and there was a family history of 2 boys dying of the condition on the father's side. So we happened to get the karyotyping and the genetic analysis and the probe testing for SMN1 gene sequence of the chromosome on that particular chromosome 1 using direct and indirect genetic study, and we did the karyotyping and analysis of both the parents of the couple and the husband's sister and the husband's brother as well. And we could, once we analyzed the diagnosis, we were able to bring out a probe which was able to detect this particular defect, which was identified on the genes for this couple. And so a probe was prepared for spinal muscular dystrophy detection. Later on, we proceeded with an IVF station using an antagonist protocol. Most of our cycles, 95% of our cycles at OSS are antagonist protocols, because nowadays we are having good success rates with this protocol. We had 13 oocytes we treat because she had a good ovarian reserve, 11 matured. ICSI was done, 10 day 3 embryos. Discussion was done on how many have to be sent for biopsy. They had 9 day 5 embryos which were available, and the couple were keen on sending all the 9 embryos for biopsy, and this was the report that we had. And we did a pre-genetic testing for single gene deletion mutation, and when 9 embryos were sent for testing, we found that 3 were abnormal and all the other chromosomes were having a normal carrier status. So either it was one of the genes which were absent. And when we say normal, the embryo was found to inherit the at-risk halotype, when its effect is going to be unaffected. And when we say carrier, it is at risk of 1/2 haplotype, and they tend to have the carrier from the parents. Since either of the parents were carriers, it was very unlikely to have an abnormal embryo in this particular patient, and she could not have a normal embryo. So we were left with only the carrier embryos, and this PGTM is what was formerly called as pre-genetic diagnosis, and it decreases the chances of having a child with inherited genetic disease. So we analyze the DNA of each embryo, and the unaffected embryos are preferentially selected for transfer. And this is indicated most of the times for single gene disorders like beta thalassemia, sickle cell anemia, spinal muscular dystrophy, CFTRA gene mutations, hemophilia, and muscular dystrophy. And benefits include that we can identify the infected embryo. We have to create a unique probe which is customized and designed for each and every couple, and they need to attend in-depth genetic counseling sessions. And one concern here was like the first baby was affected with the genetic problem, and why did the other 2 embryos miscarry, or why did she have the other 2 miscarriages? So what was found in the data or statistics in literature was that 50% of the embryos, even if they have normal, and if they come from a couple who are inherited with sickle gene disorders, they would be having associated other chromosomal abnormalities. So this struck us to the probability that the next 2 embryos could have been a chromosomally abnormal embryo. Hence, we proceeded with the PGTA, that is pre-genetic testing for chromosomal aneuploidy. And when we subjected the normal carrier embryos, 6 of the embryos which came as carriers for PGTA, 2 are suppressed, 2 of them were abnormal. And this abnormality was complex abnormal when more than 6 chromosomes were abnormal, and 2 abnormal chromosomal trisomies at 15 and 20, which is completely not related to her existing disorder. So we were justified in doing a PGTA in this couple And when we have 4 normal embryos, we proceeded with a single embryo transfer, since we have about 90% chances of success rate with single embryo transfers in frozen replacement cycles at our center. So we most of the time emphasize on a single embryo transferring an euploid embryo, and she conceived and the beta HCG was good. And she delivered a baby boy 3.3 kgs by cesarean section, and the baby was tested for the gene analysis and the muscular tests were the neuromuscular testing was done, and everything turned out to be normal, and the child is now alive and healthy. So we were able to give the couple a healthy pregnancy, even though these patients, we may not be able to say that two concepts in this particular lady. What I wanted to highlight was that it can be a problem, and it can also be most of the times if there is a genetic problem or a gene disorders, we can still help the couple in achieving a successful pregnancy. And in the genetic causes, 50% of the time, sometimes we may have an abnormal embryo. So the first thing to rule out in a recurrent miscarriage is to look for the chromosomal abnormalities in the couple. Thank you very much for your time, and I think the session will be open for this.
So if you can exit your screen, we will have, we'll be able to answer the questions in the chat. I think Swapna is having a lot of questions about your HCG, Swapna.
Yes,
could you tell us about that?
Yeah.
Your nano HCG, Swapna?
Yep. Yeah, ma'am. They were asking about what is the preparation, what we use 150 units.
Yeah.
So we use actually Pubergen Nano is the injection what is available, ma'am. It is 500 units it is available. So we can give in that 150 units. So for 7 days, patient has to buy 2 units of 500 units injection. Or else we can pair ourselves with the 5000 units HCG. We can dilute it with 5 ml of distilled water, and we can give it, but I have never given like that, ma'am, with the 5000 units. Directly we are using Pubergen Nano, which is easily available. That is about low dose HCG.
Okay.
And
I think what else do we have from the beginning? Okay, Blastofix is an antioxidant, as you can see Dr. Vishnu Priya told already. And you've already heard about PGT aneuploidy screen from Dr. Sujata. Of course, it can be done. ERA is if we think that when we are transferring embryos, if we think that the gene expression leads to a premature aging or a late maturing of the endometrium, which is the cause of failure to implant, we can do ERA. But even with an ERA, when ERA is done, almost 65% of people do have in-phase endometrium. And that is most likely like when you're having recurrent implantation failure. When you're having biochemical pregnancies, that means there has been an implantation. So we should think beyond just the endometrial receptivity. So we need to think globally. Is the embryo normal? Is the gene expression normal? Is the endometrium okay? Is the immune modulation okay? Are we missing out anything? And as you heard from the other cases, see, tuberculosis effects, adenomyosis effects. So we cannot focus only on the endometrium, and that's why important to look at the global scenario. Okay, and Swapna, mid-luteal GnRH agonist, are you going to comment on that?
yes, ma'am. They were asking about whether it is a single dose or multiple dose. We use single dose GnRH agonist of triptorelin 0.1 on day 6 post embryo transfer. How does this GnRH agonist act, though there is no follicle? One concept is GnRH will cause LH release, which can support the corpus luteum and helping in release of progesterone. But in the absence of follicle also, GnRH is known to have effect on the endometrium directly, because the LH, which the GnRH agonist causes release in the LH, it can affect in the endometrium. There are studies which have shown that LH will cause increase in the cytokines and certain kind of growth factors in the endometrium itself. And GnRH agonist has been shown to have its effect directly on the embryo also. So there are few studies which says that GnRH agonist has a role in luteal phase support in both fresh cycles as well as frozen embryo transfer cycles. We follow only single dose protocol. There are few studies which have used multiple dose protocols also, like day 6, day 8, like alternate days they have given up to 3 to 5 doses of triptorelin. But I'm not sure about the multiple dose agonist protocol.
There are GnRH agonist receptors in the endometrium also.
Yes,
So it's not that like when you start looking at the endocrine and the gene expression and all that, you realize that there is more to science and more to the endometrium than just it listening to an outside estrogen and progesterone. So that is the reason when you are having thin endometrium, getting the ovarian follicles, even though there is no ovulation, but the ovary itself to be stimulated to some extent to give growth factors, because we are not really able to see activins, inhibins, and follistatins and the other growth factors that are coming from the ovary, which are there as a part of the folliculogenesis and the corpus luteum. We are not giving all these other proteins in a down-regulated and an estrogen replacement therapy. So there is so much more we need to know about that. Okay, there is a question. Sujata, you're there?
Yeah, I'm there.
Failed frozen transverse tubes, delinked every time she gets fluid in the cavity when preparing for ERT, how to proceed?
Yeah. Actually, when we are having a repeated fluid in the cavity, it is most of the times it is either an endometritis or a pelvic inflammatory disease. And the first thing we have to look at in that particular condition is whether her tubes are patent and open.
Yeah, tubes
I
are
have experienced a lot of patients. Yeah, yes, doctor.
Tubes are delinked, she said.
Yeah. In spite of having delinking of the tubes, that's what I was about to tell. I had a couple of patients who had normal patent tubes, which were not delinked, and she had the similar condition, and she ended up in having an ectopic pregnancy. Later on, she ended up in having a delinking of tubes, which was done here. In spite of having a delinking of the tube, she still starts developing the fluid. So most of the times, it is an endometritis component which we need to look at in this particular condition. So here, a continuous course of long-term chronic endometritis protocol in terms of continuous antibiotics like doxycycline, minocycline, put her on an antibiotic and go ahead with an embryo transfer is what works very well, and we do get good results. The second component, which is very much upcoming nowadays and which we are very frequently seeing in our practice, is the presence of a previous cesarean section scar and an isthmosine which is present. So what happens is the menstrual blood tends to get collected in this isthmosine, it gets infected, and then they tend to develop this infection and endometritis, which is going to end up in having a fluid collection. So we need to take a history of a cesarean section, assess her cesarean section scar at the low. We need to concentrate in our scans at the uterine lower segment and look for the isthmosine. And if this is repeatedly happening, most of the times these patients do complain of having a brownish discharge or an intermenstrual spotting in the history as well. So sometimes we may end up in doing a hysteroscopy and repair of the isthmosine. We did have a couple of cases where we had to do an isthmosine repair and then she did conceive. So these are the things which we need to look at. So the first thing whenever there is a fluid is infection. It could be from the tubes and pelvic inflammatory disease, which could be from the uterus and chronic endometritis. It could be from the isthmosine. So broad coverage of antibiotics, and we may have to look at the endometriotic antibioma also, and we are getting more and more advanced tests where we may have to study the endometrium for presence of inflammatory markers as well.
At the last Ishri, there was a very good presentation where on hysteroscopy, when you go very close and see, when you see the surface not smooth, a little rough, up and down, a little sticky, a little mucoid discharge. So those are called micropolyps. And when the bacteria that are there or in those are not the ones that are routinely culturable. So for that, you have to do bacterial DNA analysis to try to get it. So rather than that, a 3-week, for all those when they had found, they found that a 3-week course of doxycycline does help. So a long one. So along with that, you need to, because such a long antibiotic is going to change entire gut flora, the vaginal flora. And then they will say that we don't have that good flora for the endometrial microbiome is altered. So even maybe using probiotics will help. Okay.
Yeah, and actually, in my practice, whatever hysteroscopies which we are doing as a pre-ART hysteroscopies, we do find around 30 to 40% of them have this focus of infection and what you were saying as the mucus or micropolyps are noticed. So we need to have an eye of vision looking for them and put her on antibiotics, and probably Dr. Priya putting her on antibiotics and do the transfer. Still she has a fluid. We had one lady whom we did at Vizag where we did aspirate the fluid just before the transfer and changed the embryo transfer catheter and then went ahead with the transfer, and she did conceive. So don't they try, if at all she's got good number of embryos, probably you can try doing a single embryo transfer and take the risk of transferring, maybe it might work out.
Yeah.
So don't cancel the cycle because of fluid in the cavity.
And one more thing sometimes I feel is the endometrial transudate does not really get absorbed when it is a very stenotic internal loss with an acute anteversion, acute retroversion. So in those also, when we do a hysteroscopy, it does come out later on. You don't find that because we do some amount of cervical dilatation. And we have one question, a 30-year-old married for 2 years with an AMH of 1.29. Will she conceive? Her investigations are normal. Anyone wants to take it up? Vishnu Priya, what do you think? 30-year-old, 2 years married life, AMH 1.29. Okay, I think
we need further investigations with her. 1.25 is the AMH value is okay. It's not a problem. And we can do further investigations, FSH, LH, AFC, see everything and do tubal patency. After that, we can plan pregnancy for her after doing all these investigations.
Yeah. See, if her tubes are patent and the male factor is within normal limits, I think we should be taking up an active management for her conception rather than telling her that your reports are normal, you will conceive. So it is very important to make sure she's ovulating, make sure she has her lifestyle modification, because what we need to realize is oocyte is another cell in the body. Sperm is another cell in the body. If there's an unhealthy body, you're not going to get great oocytes. So in these people, looking at the lifestyle, looking at the BMI, looking at the stress levels that they're undergoing through, all these also do contribute, because there are umpteen number of studies which followed up patients post IVF failure after 5 years. What happens to them? So unless they have absolute issues that are causing sterility, like azoospermia, ovarian failure, bilateral tubal block, unless it is something like that, quite a large number of these unexplained infertilities, almost 60% did conceive in 5 years. It is just that they're off the stress. So we cannot tell her that your AMH is low and you will not conceive. But it is important that we give her a time frame. Okay, she wants, they've been married for 2 years and they're living together for 2 years, means it is time to start evaluating her tubal testing or do something like that. We don't advise aggressive management. Anything else, Sujata, Swapna, Harsha?
Yeah, ma'am, AFCs also, I think we should get the information about the antral follicle count here.
Yeah. Like the thing is that it is important to tell that just low level of AMH or a borderline level, for a 30-year-old, we do expect the AMHs to come down. It is not that at 30 years, your AMH is 1.2, at 32 years, it's going to be 0.6. There's nothing like that. There are quite a large number of people whose AMHs stay at the same level. So it is important to continue to follow it up. Okay. Any other? Okay, Dr. Kiran wanted some polls. Kiran?
Yes, ma'am, I'm here.
Yeah, what did you want?
So, ma'am, just a couple of minutes I will take for some questions we want to know about various topics. So, I request the audience to click on the polls and select the answers. We are basically trying to find out what kind of webinars.
Yes. So, we are 125 people. Let's do this and finish the rest of the questions.
Yes, ma'am. So, I will just request a couple of minutes for the polls, ma'am.
Yes. Each one is doing it?
Yes.
So if you have please done it, and there was a question, HCG in luteal phase support, in FET, in all patients or patients with RPL. See, all these treatments, if you really think it will help, it is important that we generate data. So you write down, as Dr. Sujata had showed, how neatly the case sheet is to be written down. So like that, in your things, you document the reason why you gave it. And after a particular point of time, do analyze your data. These are the people I gave it. These are the people I haven't given it. And this is the result that I'm finding. Because there is no blanket treatment. Recurrent pregnancy loss and recurrent implantation failure, diminished ovarian reserve, poor responder, all these are having wide variety of reasons, and all of them are put in the same basket. So you can't give the same treatment for everyone. Like as you saw Harsha's case, maybe it was an underlying COX, latent tuberculosis, paucibacillary, which caused that lady to go in for a low reserve. So in her, if we give DHEA, how is it going to work? So it is not. So like that, you can't have one particular reason. In RPL, if you think the pregnancy loss is because of poor placentation, then there will be a role of giving HCG as well. Otherwise it will not work. I think we need to really look at, try to, for every diagnosis that we make, try to find the underlying cause, and that is very important. Okay, we have one case from Dr. Sindhu. Turner syndrome, no hydrosalpinx, fluid noted, straw color 60, could not be, to recollect sample. So as we were saying, this could be a sort of transudate. One thing that we need to do in Turner syndrome is that in all cases of Turner syndrome, doing the oocyte donation ICSI embryo transfer is not the end all, because they have underlying abnormal collagens. So there is a very high incidence of dissection of aorta, cardiac anomalies, sudden rupture of the aneurysm mid-pregnancy. So Turner syndrome patients, like we need to have a thorough, we need a MR angiogram and an evaluation before you start planning about it. So as we were saying, so some of the this TB, it might not really be a tuberculosis. So look for other evidence also. Okay. Any other comments anyone wants to make? We have one question: 2 IV failures, normal hormones, DFI, culture normal, endometrial vascularity, 14, 2 blasts. Okay, 14 M2, 2 blasts, only 4 blasts. So I think this is the right time to start doing PGA, aneuploidy, screen for these, and go ahead for that. And so Sujata had said, Sujata, can you give us an idea about how much that baby cost that couple? We need to know how precious children are.
I mean, the routine IVF costing, initially when I started off, now we have almost done nearly about 200 cases of PGPA at Vijayawada OSS itself. Initially, when we started off, it was a quite expensive thing. Like they were charging somewhere around, we were charging somewhere around 2.5 lakhs at that time. Slowly we got that cost down, we worked out, and we've increased the number of procedures and we brought it down, and now it is about 40,000 per embryo.
Yeah, so
it's not very expensive now, but I mean, like it all depends on how keen the couple are on getting their genetic material. Because our motto as a fertility specialist is not only about trying to make them pregnant, but if there is a possibility that we can give them their own genetic material, probably we should work on that.
Yeah, so and we need to remember that when we have a strong suspicion of genetic abnormalities and things like this, it is better to do it when the couple are young. Because when you saw after those so many embryos, there were only 5 that were not aneuploid, which were carriers, which could be transferable. So if you don't have that many embryos, if you have 5 oocytes, you have 3 embryos and 1 blastocyst, what are we going to do with that? So the most important thing is timely referral to a unit which has the facilities if the couple is willing and keen on having their own genetic material, to do it when they're young. I think that is a thing, rather than use all antioxidants, all things. Nothing in the world beats age for the women. Okay, and I think we had we're getting good number of compliments. Okay, as I said, if TB PCR is positive and you have any other signs, please do get tuberculosis, because tuberculosis is not infrequent. Tuberculosis infection is fairly common. Tuberculosis as a disease is not very common when there are good immune system for the couple. So if there is malnourishment, if there is an addition of AIDS or something that is compromising the immunity, then tuberculosis will definitely come out. And Dr. Kiran, you wanted to have a minute of our time. We are here, and I think we can close the session.
Yes, ma'am. Actually, I was lost in the discussion as always.
Please don't leave. Kiran has something to say.
Yeah, so I would like to propose the vote of thanks. First of all, a big thanks to ma'am for, first of all, organizing, presenting, and moderating an excellent session. I think the session key highlights are basically a lot of subjects are emphasized, ma'am, right from history taking to various subjects which are very important and challenging to all of you. It will be a great learning experience for the audience as well. And I would like to thank Dr. Sujata ma'am, Dr. Swapna ma'am, Dr. Vishnupriya, as well as Dr. Sri Harsha, giving a lot of depth to their presentations. And definitely, ma'am, Padmaja ma'am, we will have future webinars with the ISAR chapter of AP as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Harsha, for cutting short your presentation, because all of us, we had so many questions coming up, and we really wanted to finish it by 6:30. Thank you, my panelists. And Kiran, I must have really bothered your mind so many times telling do this, do this. Thank you for the support, and thank you, Sheel. Okay, good day.
Thank you, Dr. Padmaja ma'am, panelists and esteemed audience.
Thank you, Dr. Padmaja. Thank you, Sheel. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for making it informative. Swapna, Vishnupriya, and Harsha. Good job.
Thank you.
Thank you all panelists. Very good idea to discuss this type of cases rather than discussing a single topic. It's very nice.
Yeah, very good initiative from her.
No, the thing is, I felt every case that we come across, in fact, almost every case nowadays does challenge our mind. Some things are, it is a challenge to keep things simple, because we are aggressively trying to push things, and sometimes it's whatever we end up doing, we are frustrated, and end of the day, you can see by the face and the gait of the couple that are walking in that their urine pregnancy test is negative. So we go through that emotional turmoil with everyone, and I think that whatever we learn, it is very important to share so that it is of benefit to some couple or the other. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kiran. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am.